some devotees have requested me to put together some information about how the poison issue and the Ritvik issue and what was later known to be the bogus appointment issue, the so-called appointment of gurus issue, are connected. So we would like to first of all point out that the documents that Prabhupada made were suppressed. For example, the letters were suppressed. The 1977 conversations were suppressed. The will was suppressed. So all this information was being suppressed, and it was very difficult to understand what Prabhupada had actually said about so many different issues when all of these documents were being hidden from the mass of devotees. And in fact, Sulochan, when he came out with the letters, he was threatened by different leaders of ISKCON that he wouldn't live very long if he kept publishing the letters. So there was a very intense effort to suppress the documentation that Prabhupada had made, and of course this created a lot of confusion, which you'd expect. If major chunks of Prabhupada's instructions were lost or they were being misrepresented, then this would create a lot of problems naturally. So that was the first problem. We didn't have the documents to support the Ritvik issue. We didn't have the documents to support the poison issue at the beginning in 1978, say for example. So we were kind of winging it along. We understood right away that Prabhupada had always said he wasn't going to appoint gurus because the Gaudiya Math appointed gurus, and this is a bogus idea. So we already had some pretty good ideas about Prabhupada's instructions. He also said many times he was only going to have a governing body after he departed. So that was also pretty clear. So certain things that he had wanted were already pretty clearly established. But what happened after 1978, the GBC said, well, no, Prabhupada didn't really want a governing body. He wanted appointed gurus, and he appointed 11 gurus. And when we asked for evidence of that, well, there was no evidence. So, and we were suppressed for even asking the question. So the Ritvik issue and the poison issue are connected together because in both instances the documentation was suppressed, so it was very hard to uncover these events and these instructions. But it is interesting that, for example, Tamal Krishna told Satsvarup, this is on an audio tape, he said that Prabhupada had wanted us to give him something to make him disappear. So he was really saying he had some authority to poison Prabhupada and get him out of the way because Prabhupada had asked to be poisoned. Basically what Tamal Krishna was saying to Satsvarup at that time. And why was he saying that? Because he was thinking he might have to cover his tracks. This poison issue might come out, and if it did come out, that was going to be his excuse. That Prabhupada had asked to be given something to make him disappear. In other words, Prabhupada had asked to be poisoned. So that tape, where Tamal was talking to Satsvarup, didn't come out for, I don't know, maybe 20 years until after 1977. So it was a very long time before all these different things started to unravel and become known more publicly. So this was a big problem, that this information was suppressed. So both the Ritvik instruction that Prabhupada had only appointed Ritviks and the fact that he was claiming that someone was poisoning him, this information too was suppressed. So all this was suppressed for some time. And we would say the person who suppressed it was primarily Tamal. Tamal was guiding this whole thing along by, number one, suppressing information, and number two, presenting false information, about what Prabhupada allegedly wanted. Prabhupada didn't want only people to be Ritviks or priests. He wanted full-blown Diksha Guru successors. So let's start out with the so-called appointment tape. In May of 1977, Srila Prabhupada supposedly appointed 11 people as his successors. But we couldn't see the tape. We couldn't see the evidence. I asked for that tape, couldn't get it. And I've discussed this on some of my other tape audios of how it was so difficult to get this May tape. Now, Sulochon got what was supposed to be the May tape from the archives, but it took him until 1984 to get a copy of this tape. This was the so-called appointment tape, the Appointment of Gurus tape. But right away, Sulochon thought this tape has been spliced. It didn't sound right. There was changes in the background noise. There was a lot of starts and stops, and just places where Prabhupada just seems to be cut off. He's in mid-sentence, and all of a sudden things end. So we thought it was spliced or doctored, and a company run by Norman Pearl, an expert on audio, he confirmed that this tape has been edited, and he said it was consistent with tampering. So what happened was there was a lot of conversations in 1977 about these issues, the Ritvik issue. According to Gauridas Pandit, the secretary of Prabhupada at the time, personal secretary, he confirmed that many tapes were being made, but these tapes were not available later on. Especially they weren't available early on. Early on, none of these conversations were available at all. I mean, some were later on released, but not all of them. There are many dates where conversations were taking place, and we don't have those conversations. So we think some of those conversations were used to make this so-called May 28th appointment tape. But on the tape, Prabhupada doesn't appoint anyone as a successor. No names are given. And all he really says is that in the future, initiations will be conducted after he is gone by Ritviks, by priests. He doesn't name successor gurus even on the tape itself. So no wonder this tape was suppressed. So Sulochon brought out the tape, and shortly after that he was murdered, and he brought out the letters. So these documents were meant to be hidden and suppressed indefinitely, and the leaders did not want this information to come out. That's very clear. But anyway, the May 28th tape was spliced, was edited. Who did that? Well, we think Tamal did that. And who suppressed the tape and wouldn't allow it to be distributed to the public? Well, we think Tamal had a lot to do with that. And the others just went along with that because they were benefiting from the situation. So the same thing happened with Prabhupada's will. We couldn't get a hold of it. I only got a copy of it from Hansaduda's safe in 1984. The 1977 conversations were not being distributed to the devotees. They were being hidden. They were not published until 1990, and only in a very limited edition. It's very hard to get a hold of copies of these conversations. And, of course, the poison tape, the so-called poison tape, was also not being distributed to the devotees. We didn't have access to all these different points of information. So some people have said, well, why did you take so long to come up with the Ritvik idea? Well, because we didn't have the documents. That's why. And anyone who had documents was being beaten up and chased out and harassed or killed, like Sulochon. So it was very hard to get hold of these documents. So who was suppressing all these documents, and who was orchestrating that? Tamal. Tamal and his henchmen and his crew and his friends. They were, intentionally keeping these documents away from the hands of the devotees. But we have to understand how these things are linked. The Ritvik issue is connected to the poison issue because in both cases the documentation was suppressed. And that's why it took so long for these issues to emerge. So a devotee was present in 1977 when Prabhupada was leaving his body, and he saw Bhakti Charu crying outside of Prabhupada's room, and he asked what's wrong, and Bhakti Charu says, Prabhupada is complaining that he's being poisoned. Now that devotee is the devotee who eventually got me the tape, the so-called poison tape, but I didn't get that until 1997. That's how long we had to wait to get this tape. And he said, don't give my name out to anybody. I don't want to be publicly connected to, giving you this tape. So you can just see the mood that was going on at the time. People were very paranoid about bringing out the letters or the tapes or anything. If you could bring out this evidence that the guru appointment was bogus and these people had only been appointed as Ritviks, and if you could bring out evidence that poisoning was going on, or if you could bring out evidence that child molesting was going on, or evidence of anything, you would be suppressed. That was the mood at the time. And it's still pretty much the mood. I mean, people are not really allowed to speak freely in that GBC-controlled environment. That's just the way it was going on at that time. Anyway, so I got the tape, and I took it to a Bengali gentleman who was an editor, and he did a pretty good job of translating the Bengali of that tape. And, in fact, very few additions were made to that tape later on by other people. It was pretty well done right from the start. And in the tape, Prabhupada is saying, someone is giving me poison. So it's pretty clear why they hid this tape, because Prabhupada is directly saying, someone is giving me poison. And just prior to that, he had said, my only request is, don't torture me and put me to death. And he also said, get me out of this room because there's a Ravana in this room who might kill me. Many, many things are being said on these tapes, which you can see why they would hide these tapes and suppress these tapes. But the information was known to some people, or some of this information was known to some people. For example, Nanda Kumar, he said that all these leaders were laughing like hyenas in Prabhupada's room while Prabhupada was dying, and he would either have to kill them or get out of there. So he knew something was very wrong. And he just chose to leave, so he just left Vrindavan. And Adridaran was in the room, and he was very alarmed. And he said, hey, Prabhupada is complaining about being poisoned. This is a very dangerous situation. What's going on here? He said that at the time. So he knew something was wrong. And Bhakti True, of course, knew something was wrong. He was crying outside the room. So there was a group of people who knew something was going on. And Prithu Putra, who was a sannyasi, I think, from France, he left ISKCON, and he told some of his relatives, supposedly, that Prabhupada was killed by the leaders, and that's why he himself had to leave ISKCON. And he left ISKCON and became like a very depressed, drug addict type person, because he felt, everything was falling apart. But he did say that Prabhupada had been killed by the leaders, or at least allegedly, or apparently that's what he said. So there were people who knew what was going on, but, again, we didn't have this evidence right at the beginning. And the Kaviraj also said that Prabhupada is being poisoned, because he has the symptoms, and because he says he's being poisoned. So a number of people knew at the time, but didn't want to say, because they were very paranoid. They were very worried about Tamal and his henchmen and his regime coming after them. Now, when Prabhupada's body was being buried, Narayan Maharaj was helping Tamal, and very oddly, the Narayan Maharaj people think that's something wonderful. Oh, it's wonderful. Narayan Maharaj was helping Tamal. What? Why is that wonderful? It's like saying, we were helping Judas cover up the evidence of a murder. Why is that a wonderful thing? That's not a wonderful thing. You, Narayan Maharaj, became Tamal's best pal. You started hanging around with Tamal. Well, he's the Judas of our movement. He's the person most people believe is responsible, directly or indirectly, for poisoning Prabhupada. And so it's not a glorious thing that you were hanging out with Judas. And it's amazing to me how the followers of Narayan Maharaj keep telling me over and over again, oh, this is wonderful. He was hanging out with Tamal. What? But so that also came out later on, that Narayan Maharaj, at first he was very skeptical, and he was actually very annoyed that I came out with this poison issue, because he said, Tamal is the dear Tamal tree of Radharani, and Pranjan is making offenses to Tamal, and But eventually we just kept hammering and hammering and hammering, and finally even Narayan Maharaj had to surrender and say, yeah, you know what? They did poison Prabhupada. So even he had to surrender to the fact that he was Judas's handmaiden servant for many, many years. He had to very reluctantly agree that that's what happened. Now, one question we get on a regular basis is, who were Tamal's main accomplices in the poison issue? And unfortunately, they're the same main accomplices who helped him with the bogus appointment of guru issue and the suppression of the Ritvik issue. Now, on the tape, there's a whisper which says, J, goddammit, J. Well, who's J? There's only one J in the room. It's J Israel, Jai Advaita. So he was there. He was talking intimately with the members of that circle, obviously. Bhavananda is heard a number of times giggling and laughing, and this what must be what Nanda Kumar is talking about, how people were laughing. It seems to me that Bhavananda was one of the main laughing individuals while Prabhupada was complaining of being poisoned. Now there's another whisper that says poison Ishvarya Rasa. I don't think that was Adridharan. I don't think that was Bhakti Charu. I think that was Jayapataka. So those would be my personal main suspects in this whole thing. Tamal, the ringleader, and Jayapataka and Bhavananda going along with it, and Jayadvaita being some sort of a handmaiden in the middle of the situation. And if you think about it, these are the people who really promoted this whole living guru thing after Prabhupada left. These are like the main people who really went to town claiming that Prabhupada had wanted appointed Diksha gurus. So I believe that's the core conspiracy of people. Tamal and his little clique were part of the poison thing, and then like Satsvarup went along to get along. He became their writer. He became the main writer of the GBC. He began to write all of their papers. I don't think he would have poisoned Prabhupada, or he would have gone along with poisoning Prabhupada, at least not physically, but he poisoned Prabhupada by saying Prabhupada wanted fools to be his successors. I mean, that's another way that Prabhupada was poisoned, by misrepresenting what he said. You know, if you say that Krishna wants a fool to be his successor, that's an insult to Krishna. So, you know, there's different ways of poisoning the pure devotee, you know, I would say. But as far as physically poisoning him, I think that's the main group. Pretty much the guy who gave me the tape, he seems to think those people are part of that group as well. Those are the main suspects. Now another devotee wrote to tell me, oh, I got it all wrong. The person who killed Prabhupada was Bhakti Charu. Bhakti Charu gave him too much water. Prabhupada had requested water, and Bhakti Charu was pouring a ton of water down Prabhupada's throat, and that choked him to death. So he thought I had it all wrong. Bhakti Charu is the person who killed Prabhupada. It's very hard to say, but it is odd that he became so dedicated to supporting Tamal and Bhavananda and Jayapataka after all this came down. He knew that Prabhupada complained of being poisoned, and he knew these were probably people involved with that, and then he goes ahead and promotes them as acharyas, and then he gets a piece of the pie himself, or he gets what we would call the Judas gold leftover remnants. So Tamal said, I am the Guru Shakti manifestation of Prabhupada, and this created a big disturbance with the GBC. They tried to get rid of him at the time, but they couldn't get rid of him because he was going to pull the carpet out from under the whole thing and expose the guru appointment as being a bogus fraud. So it's very difficult to get rid of this guy. And, you know, I heard that he was also helping build his own Vyasasan. He was very, you know, infatuated with being worshipped. Now, Prabhupada had tried to send Tamal to China, so we think Tamal held a grudge against Prabhupada. Tamal argued with Prabhupada over this point. He didn't want to go to China. He refused to go in the end. And he seemed to be very anti-householder. He wanted to send the householders to a farm in Australia. Prabhupada was very disturbed by that. The Radha Damodar program that Tamal was running was siphoning manpower out of the temples. This was causing chaos for the temples. The temple presidents had many emergency meetings, you know, complaining about the Radha Damodar program. Prabhupada had to keep trying to keep all these things in check. So there was a lot of ambition in Tamal in particular. And Prabhupada said things like that. He would say that Tamal is very ambitious and he wants to control everything and stuff like that. Prabhupada made comments like about Tamal on a regular basis. So Tamal was, in my opinion, the Judas of ISKCON. He was the person who really destroyed ISKCON by ambition. He was just ambitious. He wanted to be worshipped. He wanted to have his own movement. And when he saw that the GBC wasn't going to help him, then he ran off to Narayan Maharaj, and he was going to start a program with Narayan Maharaj. And Gaura Govinda Maharaj supported that because he also was sympathetic with Narayan Maharaj. And most of his followers ran off to Narayan Maharaj after Gaura Govinda left, because he was another guy who wanted to make his own independent situation, a separate thing from ISKCON, and establishing his own worship. Gaura Govinda wanted to be worshipped himself. And if Narayan Maharaj could help him with that, then fine. So Tamal was ambitious, and he attracted ambitious people into his camp. So eventually what happened was we had to make a lawsuit. A bunch of the children of ISKCON made a lawsuit for child abuse in Dallas. Tamal was part of that lawsuit, but he didn't want to go to India. He didn't want to go to India and discuss the lawsuit. The GBC insisted, you got to come here, you got to come to India, we're going to discuss this issue. He didn't want to go, and for years he avoided going to India. He had a premonition, if I go there it could be a bad situation. He ended up going there. At the end of the meeting, he's driving away, and a big truck pulls out and he dies. Now some people think that Jayapataka paid some truck driver to pull out in front of Tamal's car to kill him, because Jayapataka felt that Tamal was trying to start his own independent thing with Narayan Maharaj or something else, and Tamal was going to be a problem. And, they had already had this problem with Tamal with the Guru Shakti thing. So did the other GBC kill him? I don't know. I couldn't prove that, but the bottom line is there was a lot of friction amongst these so-called successors to God, which also happened in the Gaudiya Math. There was a lot of infighting amongst the so-called guru successors to God in that program as well. And we have people who were friendly with these gurus, and after they became gurus for some years, and they were complaining that at the GBC meeting, the other GBCs were basically wishing they could just strangle each other and beat up each other and maybe kill each other. And there was no love there. And Satsvarupa wrote that at the GBC meetings, they were all yelling and shouting at one another. So there was a lot of internal conflict amongst themselves, but they all agreed that they had to carry on following the big lie that Tamal had started, that they were appointed as the guru successors. So obviously they're not qualified to be gurus. Prabhupada also said neophytes cannot be Diksha gurus, because if they try to do that, they'll get sick, they'll fall down, or both. And as we see, most of them fell down, got sick, or both, and a number have died prematurely because they're not qualified to absorb sins. You have to be a person like Jesus to absorb sins. So Prabhupada warned us many times, don't be a Diksha Guru. You can't do that. You're not qualified to absorb the sins. And so Tamal died prematurely, and he was sick, and he was in the hospital, and and that's been the story with many or most of these people. They're suffering the reaction from violating the order of their guru. And at the same time, they're implicated in supporting a person who probably, apparently, and we would say definitely, poisoned their guru. So if you're supporting a person who kills pure devotees, or tries to kill pure devotees, and you're even worshipping that kind of person, then what kind of situation will you have for your mission and for yourself? Now, after Tamal left his body due to this accident, or maybe it's not an accident. In India, a number of people blamed me for his death. They said, you, Pranjan, encouraged the molestation lawsuit. Because of the molestation lawsuit, Tamal went to India, and you caused his death. He wouldn't be dead if he had not gone to this meeting in India. And he wouldn't have gone to this meeting except he was coerced to go to discuss the molestation problem. So I got blamed for Tamal's untimely departure. Of course, many of our friends were happy that Tamal had departed, and they said, good job, Pranjan, he's gone. The only people who were not happy, really, outside of the GBC people, were Sanat and Mukunda and Prahlad and the HKC Jaipur type guys. They're very fried. They say, oh, Pranjan got Tamal killed by starting a child molestation issue. That's horrible. So there's a lot of sympathy for these guys, for Judas. A tremendous amount, and that is why Tamal was able to pull off what he did, because he has tremendous sympathy inside the institution, and even outside the institution there are people who claim to be following Prabhupada, but they're infuriated that we got rid of Tamal. They're not happy. So they would rather see Judas walking around. That's what they would be happy to see. And they're not happy that we may have had a hand in eliminating Judas from walking around the planet. But Tamal was the kingpin, and I think now that he's gone, their whole thing is going to fall apart. I mean, he was the mastermind. He was the person who really kept the show together. He started the Chakra website with the intention of countermanding me. They says, we got to stop this guy Pranjan. We have to stop this poison issue. We need to write. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need to make our own propaganda to counteract, what we're doing. So our propaganda has had a major impact on events and on Tamal personally. And ultimately, it may have caused his demise, our propaganda. So I think that Krishna wanted him to have his little play for a little short period of time and have it end, and have things be restored back to the original teachings of Prabhupada. I think now that everyone's going to really focus on what did Prabhupada really say, what did Prabhupada really want, and it's going to become much more clear for the future that Prabhupada did not want artificial Diksha gurus headed up by Tamal and his clique, and that will be eventually destroyed or eradicated by the time factor, and Prabhupada will be reestablished, and what he wanted will be reestablished. And the so-called GBC we have now is not a GBC. They're a bunch of Diksha gurus claiming to be a management body, but they can't manage their gurus. Their gurus keep doing renegade crazy things, and they can't do anything about it. So they have to change the whole designation. They're not Diksha gurus. And the only way they're going to become manageable is when they have the right designation, which is they're just temporary, fallible managers. That's what they are. That's what they're supposed to be. And that is what Prabhupada intended them to be, despite all the propaganda by Tamal and the people who went along with his program. Now, I think a lot of people would agree that ISKCON has been pretty much devastated by Tamal's empire of living gurus, and the ISKCON society has suffered terribly from lawsuits, bad publicity, fallen down leaders, and the different lawsuits and crimes going on which were publicized, and so on and so forth. So how did all this happen? Well, if we look at the story of the demigods, many similar stories are there that they offended their guru, or they neglected their guru, and the result was that their empire was overtaken by the rascals. So the same thing happens in ISKCON. If we allow these offenses to go on, we allow false people to be worshipped as the successors to God, then you're going to have problems. That's all there is to it. But it was well known that Prabhupada had disbanded the GBC, saying they were pounds, shillings, and pence people, that he had often criticized the GBC for mismanaging, for not following. Prabhupada said this sinister movement is within my movement. Prabhupada had all kinds of problems and headaches with Kirtananda, all kinds of problems and headaches with Harikesh, all kinds of problems and headaches with Bhagavan. Jayatirtha, it was known he was carousing around with women, and so Prabhupada tried to send him to England to get him out of trouble, and so many other things. The writing was on the wall that these people were not qualified to be acharyas. It was well known. So why would all of a sudden everybody say these guys are acharyas? That means people, overrode their common sense. Common sense would tell you they're not acharyas, and we should not worship them as acharyas, and we should not offer bhoga to them. And nor can they absorb sins like Jesus. They're not qualified to do all these things. But most of the devotees went along with this. And so Tamal didn't just hijack the mission, he was enabled and empowered by the mass of people who went along with it, and who enabled it, and who promoted it, and who empowered it, and many still are. Many original Prabhupada disciples are still promoting and going along with this program. And that is how it was able to hijack and overtake the society. It was enabled to do so by the mass of people who co-opted with it. Now, I'll give an interesting example that I see personally. There's a little teeny dog that my landlord owned, and there was a big giant pit bull in the backyard, and when the big pit bull would bark at me through the mesh fence, the little dog would come out, 2.5-pound dog, and start barking at the pit bull. So what does that mean? That means the little dog would actually go and attack this big giant dog. 2.5-pound dog would attack a 70-pound dog to defend me. So what does this tell you? This tells you that this little dog is loyal. He doesn't even have love, really, for me. There's no love there. But there's loyalty. So me and Sulochan thought when the mass of devotees find out that these gurus were not appointed, they're going to rise up and demand these people be taken down or taken out. Nope. The mass of devotees did not rise up. And I thought when the mass of devotees finds out that the child molesting problem is just enormous, they're going to rise up and demand the GBC be taken out. Nope. They didn't rise up. Okay, how about the poison issue? Certainly when we point out that Prabhupada was complaining of being poisoned, the mass of people will rise up and demand that these people be taken out. Nope. So it seems like no matter what happens, no one cared, or no one really tried to rise up. Now if we go to India, we see if the train is late or some things going on, there's a traffic light that's not working, there's a protest and people are burning effigies and causing all kinds of problems because they're protesting all kinds of little incidents that are going on. Can we get our people to protest? Well, not really. So if you don't protest when people are putting fools in your guru's seat, then you get what you get and you deserve what you get. But I do think anyone who goes along with Judas and his program is doomed. And pretty much that is what Shastra says. Shastra says those who imitate the Acharya are destined for the most obnoxious regions of the universe, and I believe Tamal will go there or has gone there, and the people who supported him and sympathized with him and promoted him will partake in his karma. So it's very sad, but that's how it works. That's how karma goes around. What goes around goes around. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hari Bol.